With the relocation of the turtle eggs that's going on now, what is the survival rate of an egg in the wild per moving and incubating it?
For the survival rate on the wild eggs, moving them, I mean, I couldn't tell you exactly what the survival rate would be, but I would expect they should have a good survival rate. Working with reptiles over the last 35 years or so myself, I've moved eggs and incubated them and had very good hatch rates. I think it would be more responsible to move those eggs out of an area that might be considered in danger of being inundated with dirty water from either dispersant or oil, rather than take the chance on landing those animals. Just have a wait-and-see kind of survival. In nature, depending again on whose research that you look at, it's usually expected somewhere around, you're going to get 2 baby sea turtles out of about every 400 eggs that are going to, when those animals hatch out, if a nest of baby turtles hatch out on the beach as they're working their way down towards the water, animals like ghost crabs or seagulls or different birds are going to feed on them. If it's during the daylight, you know, there will be predators during the daylight like the birds. If it's at night, raccoon or fox, again, the ghost crabs might feed on them. When they get into the water and they're trying to swim away from the beach, fish like redfish and black drum and the sea trout, fish would love to eat a baby turtle. So very few make it off of the shore out into open water. So some of the research I've read is expecting about 2 out of every 400 eggs. And from those 2 babies out of every 400 eggs, it's usually estimated somewhere around 10,000 baby turtles are going to be needed to get one animal to survive to become an adult. So very few survive. So I think it's very important to protect as many of them as we can so we can try to get the highest survival rate we can. So even if there were a lower survival rate on the moved eggs, I personally think that it was a good thing to move them.
With you being around the marsh of Florida, what is your fear if the oil or dispersant makes it into the marsh? Like, which animals will be affected? Will it completely destroy the ecosystem, in your opinion?
I've tried to find some information on marshes. I love salt marshes, and I like to spend a lot of time in them. And I actually just did a little video myself of them. And when you go into the marsh, I think the thing that you first notice are going to be things like fiddler crabs. And if you walk into a marsh, especially here at low tide, in a marsh that's not very accessible to people, the numbers of fiddler crabs are in the millions. So and if you looked at a mile of salt marsh, that number is probably going to be somewhere between 250 million fiddler crabs in that mile of marsh. So it's a very obvious animal to see when you go into the marsh. When I look at the soil of the marsh, I guess I'm kind of odd in that with some people, because when I go in and look at the soil in the marsh, I see these 3 different size pellets. You'll see these really large round pellets, and that's where the fiddler crabs have dug burrows down into the soil, into the roots of the plants where they're staying and living and hiding at the high tide. And then you'll see a medium-sized pellet where they've been picking up the sand grains and they bring them up to their mouth and they're taking the nutrients out of it. And then you see a little tiny black pellet, and that's the excrement from the crab. So they're taking these nutrients, they're digging burrows into the soil and they're aerating the marsh grass. They're eating the nutrients actually that come from the marsh grass. As the marsh grass dies and it starts to break down, the cellulose is not a very good food source, so bacteria and fungus break that down. And then these animals like periwinkle snails or fiddler crabs feed on that, and then they drop their pellets of excrement that become fertilizer for the marsh grass. And some of that you'll see washing in the waves, and that's taken out into the bays, and it feeds things like oysters and mussels and the other benthic animals like the sea cucumbers and things that are feeding on that. You'll actually see sea cucumbers take their feeding tentacles out and dipping them in the mud and pulling in the food to feed. And a lot of that nutrients comes from the salt marsh being broken down by funguses and bacteria and fiddler crabs and periwinkle snails. So if we had oil come into the bay, going about my really long wordy way of saying it, I guess, if we have oil come into the bay and it killed the fiddler crabs, which if you get oil on the gills of the fiddler crabs, they're not going to be able to get oxygen, they're not going to be able to survive. They're not digging burrows down into the sand marsh, the soils in a salt marsh are very low in oxygen. It's very anoxic, and you can smell that when you go to marsh. Marshes have got very unique odors, and it's from all that anoxic bacteria in the soil. Digging the burrows helps to bring oxygen to the roots of the plants to help them to survive. Marsh plants have other mechanisms. There are pores that run through the stems of the plants that help to bring oxygen to the roots, but fiddler crabs are their main source. They're turning that soil over like earthworms. If we remove the fiddler crabs, the soil's stagnant, it's very anoxic, and a lot of the plants would die. If the plants die, marsh plants have got really extensive root systems that hold all of that mud, you'd start to get a lot of erosion. So instead of having a salt marsh adjacent to a bay, you would end up with just a bigger bay with less and less salt marsh areas. Birds like the clapper rails and Virginia rails feed a lot on fiddler crabs. You'll see herons eating them. I've seen raccoons and mink and otters in there feeding on things like that. They're at the base of the food chain. I would even say that they would be a keystone species in the marsh. So by killing them off, it would affect most of the other animal life in the marsh. And the adjacent bays where the nutrients are washed out to feed the animals you and I like to eat. It's estimated in Florida itself, it's somewhere about 70% of our commercial and recreational species that we fish. If you like to fish for things like tarpon and redfish and black drum, or you like to eat oysters or shrimp, 70% of both the commercial and recreational seafood species utilize the salt marsh at some point in their life cycle. So if we kill the salt marshes, we kill those industries.
And have you seen the oil affecting the salt marshes here?
Here in Florida, so far, we've been really lucky in our area. There have been a few cases of some tar balls washing up on the beaches. I think St. George Island, there was in the news, they found something like 50 tar balls or somewhere in that range wash up on the beach. So far here in our area, McCullough County, and I've been going to the beach myself. My wife and I go in and walk the beach to see if we can see any sign of anything. And so far, I've not seen any sign of any oil or dispersants in our area, so we've been really lucky. The only thing that I could say with that is I don't have any way to actually test the water to tell you if there are dispersants in the water, and I wish that there were some means for me to take a water sample and just say yes or no, there's something in this water. And if we were to have that advanced warning, if we could go out here and take water samples and say, yes, there's something in the water, something's coming into our area, you would be much more likely to go out and be able to take some type of proactive response to that and not just wait and see what happens.
Have you seen anyone testing the local waters?
I have not seen anyone out testing the local waters. If they've got people out doing water samples, I mean, I've just not seen them. I couldn't tell you if the state is out testing. I would have to say that I doubt that there's anyone out there taking water samples looking to see if there's a dispersant in the water, especially since our test for dispersant is smell test on a pile of seafood in a bowl to see if it smells like Windex.